Henry Lee Lucas was an American man who claimed to have murdered over 600 people across the United States during the 1970s and 1980s, making him appear to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history. But later investigations revealed that most of these confessions were lies, and he was only confirmed to have killed 3 people: his mother in 1960, his teenage girlfriend Becky Powell in 1982, and an elderly woman named Kate Rich in 1983. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in a small cabin in Blacksburg, Virginia. From the moment he entered this world, his life was filled with pain and suffering. His mother, Viola Lucas, was a cruel and violent woman who worked as a prostitute. She was 41 years old when Henry was born, and she made it clear from the start that she did not want him. The Lucas family lived in terrible conditions. Their home was a 3-room log cabin with dirt floors and no running water or electricity. The cabin had no heat, and during winter months, the family would huddle together for warmth. Viola would bring men home for her prostitution business, and she would force Henry and his siblings to watch while she had sex with these strangers. Henry's father was Anderson Lucas, a man who had lost both of his legs in a railroad accident years before Henry was born. Because of his disability, Anderson could not work regular jobs. He made money by brewing illegal moonshine whiskey and selling pencils on street corners in Blacksburg. The local people called him No Legs because he had to drag himself around on his hands. Anderson was also an alcoholic who drank heavily every day. The loss of his legs and his wife's cruel treatment had broken his spirit. He was constantly depressed and angry. Viola would beat Anderson regularly, just like she beat the children. She would scream at him and call him worthless because he could not walk. Henry was the youngest of 9 children, but most of his older brothers and sisters had been sent away to live with other families or put in foster care. Only Henry and one of his brothers stayed at home with their parents. This meant that Henry received the worst of Viola's abuse because there were fewer children to share her anger. From the time Henry was a very young child, Viola would dress him up like a girl. She would put him in dresses and curl his hair into ringlets like a little girl's hairstyle. Then she would send him to school dressed this way. The other children at school would laugh at Henry and make fun of him. They would call him names and sometimes hit him. When Henry came home crying, Viola would beat him for being weak. One day, a teacher at Henry's school felt sorry for him and bought him a pair of shoes because he always came to school barefoot. When Viola found out that Henry had accepted charity, she became furious. She beat him severely with a wooden board for accepting help from someone else. Viola seemed to enjoy hurting Henry and making his life miserable. Whenever Henry tried to have a pet, like a dog or cat, Viola would kill the animal in front of him. She would laugh while she did it, watching Henry cry as she hurt the animals he cared about. The violence in the Lucas household was constant and extreme. Viola would beat Henry with whatever she could find: sticks, boards, her fists, or kitchen utensils. One time, she hit Henry so hard with a piece of lumber that he fell unconscious and stayed in a coma on and off for 3 whole days. It was Viola's boyfriend, who Henry called Uncle Bernie, who finally took Henry to the hospital. Uncle Bernie was another source of horror in Henry's young life. This man introduced Henry to sexual abuse and taught him to hurt animals in terrible ways. Bernie would show Henry how to catch small animals like squirrels, rabbits, and cats, and then he would teach Henry to torture and sexually abuse these creatures before killing them. Bernie told Henry that this was normal behavior and that all men did these things. Anderson Lucas, Henry's father, could not protect his son from the abuse. Anderson was too weak and broken by his own suffering to help Henry. In fact, Anderson was so miserable that he eventually killed himself. One winter night, when Viola was entertaining another man in their cabin, Anderson crawled outside into the freezing cold snow. He stayed out there all night without any warm clothes or blanket. By morning, Anderson had caught pneumonia from being in the cold for so long. He died a few days later. After Anderson's death, Henry became the only target for all of Viola's rage and violence. With no husband to abuse, she focused all her anger on her young son. The beatings became worse and more frequent. Viola would hit Henry for any reason, or sometimes for no reason at all. When Henry was about 10 years old, he got into a fight with his older brother. During this fight, his brother stabbed Henry in the left eye with a knife. The injury was very serious, and Henry's eye became infected. However, Viola refused to take Henry to a doctor because she did not want to spend money on medical care. She let the infection get worse and worse until Henry was in terrible pain. Finally, after several days, the pain became so bad that someone else convinced Viola to take Henry to the hospital. By the time they got medical help, it was too late to save Henry's eye. The doctors had to remove the eye completely and replace it with a glass eye. This left Henry with a very distinctive appearance for the rest of his life. His left eyelid drooped, and he could not see properly out of that side of his face. The loss of his eye made Henry even more of an outcast at school and in the community. Other children would stare at him and make cruel comments about his appearance. This made Henry feel even more angry and isolated from other people. By the time Henry was a teenager, he had learned to hate everyone around him, especially women. His mother's abuse had taught him that women were cruel and violent. He began to think that all women deserved to be hurt the way his mother had hurt him. Henry also began drinking alcohol heavily when he was still very young. By age 10, he was already an alcoholic, just like his parents. He would steal liquor from his father's moonshine supplies or find other ways to get drunk. The alcohol helped him forget about the pain and abuse, but it also made him more violent and unpredictable. During his teenage years, Henry developed strange and dangerous sexual desires. The abuse he had suffered, combined with Uncle Bernie's teachings about hurting animals, had warped Henry's understanding of normal relationships. He began to fantasize about having sex with dead people and animals. These fantasies became stronger as he got older. When Henry was 15 years old in March 1951, he committed what he later claimed was his first murder. According to Henry's story, he was near Lynchburg, Virginia, when he saw a 17-year-old girl named Laura Evelyn Burnsley waiting at a bus stop. Henry approached the girl and tried to force her to have sex with him. When she fought back and tried to get away, Henry became enraged. He strangled her to death with his hands. After killing the girl, Henry said he buried her body in a wooded area near Harrisburg, Virginia. However, Laura's body was never found, so police could never prove that Henry actually committed this murder. This was the beginning of a pattern with Henry. He would confess to murders, but often there was no proof that he really did them. In 1954, when Henry was 18 years old, he was arrested and convicted of burglary. He was sent to prison for 6 years. While in prison, Henry tried to escape twice in 1957, but both times he was caught and brought back. Prison life was hard for Henry, but in some ways it was better than living at home with his mother. At least in prison, he was fed regularly and had a place to sleep. He did not have to worry about being beaten every day by Viola. Henry was released from prison on September 2, 1959. He went to live with his sister in Tecumseh, Michigan. For a short time, it seemed like Henry might be able to live a normal life. His sister was kind to him, and he was away from his mother's abuse. However, Viola was not willing to let Henry stay away from her. She demanded that he come back to Blacksburg to take care of her. Viola was now in her 60s and getting older, but she was still just as mean and violent as ever. She told Henry that it was his duty as her son to come home and help her. Henry did not want to go back to his mother's house. He knew that returning to Viola would mean returning to the abuse and violence. But Viola kept demanding that he come home, and eventually Henry gave in to the pressure. On January 11th, 1960, Henry Lee Lucas returned to his mother's cabin in Blacksburg, Virginia. He had been drinking heavily that day, and Viola had also been drinking. Both mother and son were drunk when they got into their final argument. The fight started the way their arguments always did. Viola began screaming at Henry and calling him worthless. She told him he was stupid and lazy. She said he would never amount to anything and that she was ashamed to have him as a son. These were the same cruel words she had been saying to Henry his entire life. But this time, something was different. Henry was now 23 years old and much larger and stronger than his mother. He had spent years in prison, which had made him even tougher and more violent. The alcohol in his system made him less able to control his anger. As Viola continued to scream at Henry, she picked up a broom and began hitting him with it. She struck him across the face and shoulders, just like she had done thousands of times before when he was a child. But Henry was no longer a helpless little boy. In a moment of rage, Henry grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. Later, he could not even remember if the blade was open or closed when he picked it up. All he knew was that he was filled with 23 years of hatred and anger toward his mother. Henry stabbed Viola in the neck with the knife. She fell to the floor, bleeding heavily. As she lay dying, Henry looked down at the woman who had made his entire life a nightmare of pain and abuse. For the first time in his life, he felt powerful instead of helpless. But Henry's violence did not stop there. After Viola was dead, Henry did something that shocked even the police when they found out about it later. He admitted that he had sex with his mother's dead body. This act of necrophilia showed just how damaged Henry's mind had become from years of abuse. After killing his mother, Henry tried to clean up the blood and hide what he had done. He wanted to make it look like Viola had died from an accident or natural causes. But there was too much blood, and the knife wound was too obvious. Henry realized that he could not cover up the murder. Henry left his mother's cabin and went to stay with relatives nearby. But 5 days later, the police found Viola's body. The blood-covered knife was still at the crime scene, and neighbors had seen Henry arguing with his mother before her death. It did not take long for police to arrest Henry for murder. When the police questioned Henry about his mother's death, he confessed to killing her. At first, he also admitted to having sex with her dead body, but later he took back that part of his confession. Henry's lawyers were not sure whether to argue that this was murder or manslaughter. Murder meant that Henry had planned to kill his mother ahead of time, while manslaughter meant that he had killed her in the heat of the moment without planning it. During his trial, Henry's lawyers tried to get the jury to feel sorry for him. They put Henry on the witness stand so he could tell the court about the horrible abuse he had suffered as a child. Henry talked about how Viola had dressed him like a girl, beaten him regularly, and forced him to watch her have sex with strangers. He described how she had killed his pets and refused to get medical help when he was injured. 2 of Henry's neighbors also testified at the trial. They confirmed that they had seen Viola abusing Henry throughout his childhood. They told the court that everyone in the community knew that Viola was cruel to her children. Despite the evidence of abuse, the jury found Henry guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. On March 12, 1960, he was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. Henry was sent to Jackson State Penitentiary in southern Michigan to begin serving his sentence. Prison was difficult for Henry, but the psychological damage from his childhood made it even harder. He began having mental problems and hearing voices in his head. Henry said that he could hear his dead mother talking to him, telling him to hurt people. Sometimes the voices told him to kill himself, and other times they told him to hurt other prisoners. Because of these mental problems, Henry tried to commit suicide twice while he was in Jackson State Penitentiary. The prison officials realized that Henry needed psychiatric help, so they transferred him to Ionia State Mental Hospital, where he could receive treatment for his mental illness. Henry spent almost 6 years at Ionia State Mental Hospital. During this time, doctors tried to help him deal with the trauma from his childhood and the guilt from killing his mother. However, Henry later said that his time in the mental hospital changed him in a different way. He claimed that when he was released, he was determined to kill more people. According to Henry, while he was in the mental hospital, he made a decision that he would never let anyone control him or hurt him the way his mother had done. He said he decided that he would be the one doing the hurting from then on. Whether this was true or just another of Henry's lies, his behavior after leaving the hospital showed that he had become much more dangerous. On June 3, 1970, after serving 10 years in prison and the mental hospital, Henry Lee Lucas was paroled. He went to live with relatives in Tecumseh, Michigan, and for a short time, he tried to live a normal life. He got a job and seemed to be adjusting to life outside of prison. However, Henry's violent tendencies soon surfaced again. In December 1971, just 18 months after his release, Henry was arrested and charged with molesting 2 teenage girls. The charges were later reduced to simple kidnapping, but it was clear that Henry was still dangerous. Henry was sent back to prison, this time to serve a sentence for the kidnapping charge. He was paroled again in August 1975, but this time he argued against his own release. Henry told prison officials that he was not ready to be released and that he might hurt someone if they let him out. Despite his warnings, the parole board decided to release him anyway. This decision by the parole board would prove to be a terrible mistake. Henry's warnings about his own dangerousness were accurate. Once he was released in 1975, Henry began the period of his life that would make him famous as one of America's most notorious criminals. After his release from prison in August 1975, Henry Lee Lucas tried to settle down and live a normal life. He got a job working at a mushroom farm in Pennsylvania. The work was hard and dirty, but it was honest employment. Henry also married his cousin's widow in December of that same year. For a brief moment, It seemed like Henry might be able to put his violent past behind him and become a regular citizen. However, Henry's new marriage quickly fell apart. His wife claimed that Henry had sexually molested her young daughters from her previous marriage. These accusations led to their divorce in the summer of 1977. Once again, Henry found himself alone and angry at the world. With his marriage over and his attempt at normal life failed, Henry became a drifter. He had no permanent home and no steady job. Instead, he traveled from state to state, usually hitchhiking or driving old, broken-down cars. Henry moved through the southern United States, going from Texas to Florida to Louisiana and back again. During this time, Henry claimed that he began killing people regularly. According to his later confessions, he would pick up female hitchhikers and then rape and murder them. He said he particularly targeted women who were traveling alone on Interstate 35 in Texas. However, as investigators would later discover, many of these confession stories were lies. In late 1976, Henry's life changed dramatically when he met a man named Ottis Toole at a soup kitchen in Jacksonville, Florida. Toole was 29 years old, while Henry was 40. Despite the age difference, the two men became close friends very quickly. Ottis Toole was also a dangerous criminal with a history of violence. Like Henry, Ottis had suffered severe abuse as a child. He had grown up in a family where violence and sexual abuse were common. Ottis was homosexual and had been kicked out of his home as a teenager because of his sexual orientation. Toole had his own collection of mental problems and criminal behaviors. He was an arsonist who enjoyed setting fires and watching buildings burn. He was also a cannibal who sometimes ate parts of his victims after killing them. Toole claimed that he enjoyed the taste of human flesh and that eating his victims made him feel powerful. When Henry and Ottis met, they quickly discovered that they shared similar interests in violence and crime. They began a sexual relationship, but more importantly, they became partners in robbery, rape, and murder. Both men were bisexual and had no moral boundaries when it came to hurting other people. The partnership between Henry Lucas and Ottis Toole would become one of the most notorious criminal collaborations in American history. Together, they traveled across the country, committing crimes wherever they went. They robbed stores, stole cars, and, according to their confessions, murdered dozens of people. In 1978, Henry moved in with Ottis and his family in Jacksonville, Florida. Ottis lived with his mother and sister in a rundown house in a poor neighborhood. The family was deeply dysfunctional, with mental illness and criminal behavior affecting all the members. Living in this household, Henry met two people who would become very important in his story. The first was Ottis's 10-year-old niece, Frida Powell, who went by the nickname Becky. The second was Becky's younger brother, Frank Powell. Becky Powell was a small, thin girl with developmental disabilities. She had been born with mild mental retardation, which made her think and act younger than her actual age. Despite being 10 years old, Becky had the mental capacity of a much younger child. Henry became obsessed with Becky almost immediately. He saw her as someone he could control completely, unlike the adult women who had rejected or hurt him in the past. Becky was vulnerable and dependent, which appealed to Henry's need for power and control. Henry and Ottis got jobs working for a local roofing company in Jacksonville. However, they frequently missed work because they were traveling around the country committing crimes. Their employers did not know about their criminal activities and thought they were just unreliable workers. During this period, Henry and Ottis claimed to have committed many murders together. They said they would drive to different states, pick up hitchhikers, and then kill them for money or just for the pleasure of killing. Ottis would sometimes eat parts of the victims, while Henry would have sex with the dead bodies. The two men also claimed to be members of a satanic cult called the Hand of Death. According to their stories, this cult had hundreds of members across the United States who killed people as human sacrifices to Satan. They said the cult would give them contracts to murder specific people, and they would travel around the country carrying out these assassinations. Henry and Ottis told elaborate stories about the Hand of Death cult. They claimed that new members had to kill someone as an initiation ritual. They said the cult performed crucifixions of both animals and humans as part of their satanic worship. They even claimed that the cult was connected to Jim Jones and the People's Temple Massacre in Guyana. However, investigators were never able to find any evidence that the Hand of Death cult actually existed. Police believed that Henry and Ottis had made up these stories to make themselves themselves seem more important and dangerous than they really were. The cult stories were likely just fantasies created by two mentally disturbed criminals. In 1981, Ottis's mother and sister both died within a few months of each other. This meant that Becky and Frank Powell were left without adult guardians. The state of Florida placed both children in juvenile homes, separating them from Henry and Ottis. Henry could not accept being separated from Becky. He had become emotionally dependent on having her under his control. Working with Ottis, Henry helped get Becky and Frank released from the juvenile homes. This was illegal, since Henry and Ottis did not have legal custody of the children. Once they had the children back, Henry and Ottis decided to leave Florida. They were worried that child welfare authorities would continue trying to take Becky and Frank away from them. The four of them began traveling around the country together, 2 adult criminals and 2 vulnerable children. During their travels, Becky and Frank were exposed to terrible violence and criminal behavior. They witnessed Henry and Ottis committing robberies and assaults. The children were forced to live in the same motel rooms where Henry and Ottis brought victims to rape and murder. As they traveled, Henry's relationship with Becky became increasingly inappropriate. Even though Becky was still just a child, Henry began treating her as if she were his girlfriend and wife. By the time Becky was 12 years old, Henry was having sex with her regularly. This sexual relationship was clearly child abuse, but Becky's mental disabilities made it difficult for her to understand what was happening to her. She had been taught to obey adults without question, and Henry presented himself as her protector and caretaker. Frank Powell, Becky's younger brother, was also traumatized by witnessing the violence and abuse during their travels. The constant exposure to Henry and Ottis's criminal behavior and the sexual abuse of his sister left Frank with severe psychological problems. He would later end up in a psychiatric facility. When child welfare authorities in Florida began searching for Becky and Frank in January 1982, Henry decided to take Becky even further away. He left Ottis behind and traveled with Becky to California. For several months, Henry and Becky lived on the West Coast, moving from place to place and staying in cheap motels. From California, Henry and Becky eventually made their way to Texas. In 1982, they ended up at a place called the House of Prayer, which was a religious commune near Stoneburg, Texas. The House of Prayer was run by people who believed in helping troubled individuals find spiritual salvation. The leaders of the House of Prayer did not know about Henry's criminal past or his inappropriate relationship with Becky. They saw Henry as a man who was trying to reform his life and Becky as his young wife. They offered Henry and Becky a place to stay and work to do around the commune. For a few months, Henry and Becky lived quietly at the House of Prayer. Henry worked on maintenance projects around the property, and Becky helped with cooking and cleaning. To the other residents of the commune, they seemed like a couple who were trying to build a better life. However, Becky began to feel homesick for Florida and her family. Even though Ottis and his relatives had not always treated her well, Florida was still the only real home she had ever known. Becky started asking Henry to take her back to Jacksonville so she could see her remaining family members. Henry did not want to return to Florida. He knew that there was still a warrant for his arrest in Maryland on an old charge, and he was worried about being caught by police. He also did not want to share Becky with other people who might take her away from him. As Becky continued to ask about going home, Henry became more and more frustrated. He had gotten used to controlling Becky completely, and he did not like it when she expressed her own wants and needs. The idea that Becky might want something different from what he wanted made Henry angry. In August 1982, Becky's request to go home finally wore down Henry's resistance. He agreed to take her back to Florida, but he was not happy about it. The two of them left the House of Prayer and began hitchhiking east toward Florida. What happened next would become one of the few crimes that Henry actually committed, rather than just confessing to falsely. The journey back to Florida would end in tragedy and murder, and it would eventually lead to Henry's arrest and his transformation into America's most notorious false confessor. On August 23, 1982, Henry Lee Lucas and Becky Powell were hitchhiking through Denton County, Texas, on their way back to Florida. They had been traveling for several hours, and both of them were tired and frustrated. The summer heat was intense, and they had not been able to get rides very easily. As they walked along the road, Henry and Becky began arguing about their situation. Becky was complaining about being tired and hot. She wanted to stop and rest, but Henry insisted they needed to keep moving. Becky also continued to talk about how much she missed Florida and how excited she was to see her family again. Henry was becoming increasingly irritated with Becky's complaints and her enthusiasm about returning to Florida. He had never wanted to make this trip in the first place, and Becky's constant chatter about going home reminded him that she cared more about other people than she did about him. The argument escalated as they continued walking. Becky, who was now 15 years old but still had the mental capacity of a much younger child, did not understand why Henry was getting so angry with her. She had been taught to obey Henry in everything, but now he seemed furious no matter what she said or did. According to Henry's later confession, Becky finally became frustrated enough to slap him across the face. This physical contact triggered all of Henry's rage and violent tendencies. Just as he had reacted violently when his mother hit him with a broom 22 years earlier, Henry responded to Becky's slap with extreme violence. Henry was carrying a meat-carving knife in his belongings. He pulled out the knife and stabbed Becky in the chest. The blade went deep into her body, piercing her heart. Becky died almost immediately from the wound. She collapsed on the side of the road, her blood soaking into the Texas dirt. After killing Becky, Henry did something that showed just how disturbed his mind had become. He had sex with Becky's dead body right there on the roadside. Later, Henry would tell investigators that this was the best sex he had ever had with Becky. This statement revealed the complete absence of normal human emotions or morality in Henry's character. But Henry's violence toward Becky did not end there. Using the same knife he had killed her with, Henry began cutting up Becky's body. He dismembered her corpse into 9 separate pieces, cutting off her arms, legs, and head. Then he scattered the body parts around a nearby field, trying to make sure that no one would find them all in the same place. After disposing of Becky's remains, Henry took her purse and suitcase and threw them away in a different location. He cleaned himself up as well as he could, and then hitchhiked back to the House of Prayer in Stoneburg, Texas. Henry arrived back at the commune alone, telling the other residents that Becky had decided to go with a truck driver who had given them a ride. The people at the House of Prayer believed Henry's story about Becky leaving with a trucker. It was not unusual for young people to change their minds about relationships and run off with someone new. No one suspected that Henry had actually murdered the girl they thought was his wife. For 2 weeks, Henry remained at the House of Prayer, acting as if nothing had happened. He continued to do his work around the commune and participated in religious services. To everyone around him, Henry seemed like the same person he had always been. No one suspected that he had committed murder. However, Henry could not stop thinking about what he had done to Becky. According to his later statements, he felt guilty about killing the one person he claimed to love. This guilt drove him to return to the field where he had scattered her body parts. Henry went back to the murder scene and collected as many of Becky's remains as he could find. He gathered up the bones and pieces of flesh and brought them back to the House of Prayer. There, he put Becky's remains into the commune's wood-burning stove and cremated them. Henry later said that burning Becky's body was like burning a piece of wood. 3 weeks after Becky's murder, another tragedy occurred at the House of Prayer. An elderly woman named Kate Rich, who lived nearby and sometimes helped at the commune, disappeared without explanation. Kate Rich was 82 years old and known to everyone in the area as Granny Rich. She was a kind woman who often brought food and supplies to the House of Prayer residents. Granny Rich had been particularly friendly to Henry and Becky during their time at the commune. On the day Granny Rich disappeared, Henry also vanished from the House of Prayer. His car was found abandoned in Needles, California, several days later. The timing of these 2 disappearances was suspicious, but at first, no one connected Henry to Granny Rich's disappearance. According to Henry's later confession, he had asked Granny Rich to help him look for Becky. He told the elderly woman that Becky had run away and that he was worried about her safety. Granny Rich, being a kind-hearted person, agreed to help Henry search for the missing girl. Henry picked up Granny Rich in his car, telling her they would drive around the area looking for Becky. But Henry had no intention of actually searching for Becky, since he knew exactly what had happened to her. Instead, he drove Granny Rich to a remote dirt road where no one would see them. As they drove down the isolated road, Henry grabbed a butcher's knife that he had placed on the car seat between them. He stabbed Granny Rich in the side, piercing her heart just as he had done to Becky. The elderly woman died quickly from the wound. After killing Granny Rich, Henry sexually assaulted her dead body. Then he dragged her corpse to a large drainage pipe near the road, and hid it there. Henry left Granny Rich's body in the pipe and drove away, beginning another long road trip to California. About a month later, Henry returned to Texas. He went back to the drainage pipe, where he had hidden Granny Rich's remains and retrieved them. Henry brought the bones and decomposed flesh back to the house of prayer and burned them in the same stove where he had cremated Becky's remains. For several months after the murders of Becky Powell and Kate Rich, Henry continued to live at the house of prayer. The other residents of the commune still believed that Becky had left with a truck driver, and they assumed that Granny Rich had simply moved away or died of natural causes. No one suspected that Henry had murdered both women. However, local law enforcement officials were beginning to investigate the disappearances. Granny Rich's family had reported her missing, and the police were asking questions about when she was last seen. Several people remembered seeing her with Henry on the day she disappeared. In addition to the investigation into Granny Rich's disappearance, there was still an outstanding warrant for Henry's arrest in Maryland on an old weapons charge. The police were also becoming suspicious of Henry because he was an ex-convict living at the commune under a false identity. On June 11, 1983, Henry Lee Lucas was arrested at the House of Prayer. The initial charge was illegal possession of a handgun by a convicted felon. This was a violation of his parole, and it was enough to put Henry back in jail while the police investigated the disappearances of Becky Powell and Kate Rich. Henry was taken to the Williamson County Jail in Georgetown, Texas. At first, he was held only on the weapons charge, and the police did not have enough evidence to charge him with murder. However, they continued to investigate the disappearances and to question Henry about what he knew. For 4 days, Henry sat in his jail cell, thinking about his situation. He knew that the police suspected him of murder, but he also knew they did not have enough proof to convict him. Henry could have remained silent and possibly avoided serious charges, but instead, he made a decision that would change his life and American criminal justice history. On the night of June 15, 1983, Henry summoned the jailer and asked to speak with Sheriff Jim Boutwell. When Sheriff Boutwell arrived, Henry made a statement that shocked everyone who heard it. "I've done some bad things," Henry said. He then confessed to murdering Kate Rich and claimed that he had killed at least 100 more people. This confession was the beginning of what would become the most extensive series of false murder confessions in American history. Over the next year and a half, Henry would confess to hundreds of murders, most of which he had never actually committed. These confessions would close many unsolved cases, but would also create one of the biggest scandals in law enforcement history. When Henry Lee Lucas confessed to Sheriff Jim Boutwell that he had killed Kate Rich and at least 100 more people, he set in motion a chain of events that would captivate the nation and ultimately expose serious flaws in the American criminal justice system. Sheriff Boutwell was amazed by Henry's confession. He had been investigating Kate Rich's disappearance for months without making much progress. Now, suddenly, he had a suspect who was not only admitting to that murder, but claiming to be responsible for dozens of other unsolved killings. Boutwell immediately contacted other law enforcement agencies to tell them about Henry's confessions. Word spread quickly through police departments across Texas and then throughout the United States. Detectives who had been struggling with unsolved murder cases for years suddenly saw an opportunity to clear their books. Within days of Henry's initial confession, investigators from multiple states began traveling to Georgetown, Texas, to interview him about unsolved murders in their jurisdictions. Henry seemed eager to talk to all of them, and he appeared to have an amazing memory for details about crimes that had been committed years earlier. To coordinate all of these interviews, Sheriff Boutwell and Texas Ranger Bob Prince created what they called the Lucas Task Force. This was a special unit designed to systematically go through Henry's confessions and match them to unsolved cases across the country. The task force set up operations in Georgetown, and investigators began arriving from all over the United States. They brought case files, photographs, and evidence from murders that had stumped them for years. Henry would sit in interview rooms and listen to the details of each case, then provide his own version of how the murder had been committed. What amazed the investigators was how much Henry seemed to know about these cases. He could describe crime scenes accurately, tell them where bodies had been found, and provide details that only the killer would know. When Henry's descriptions matched the evidence, the investigators would close their cases and mark them as solved. However, what the investigators did not realize was that they were giving Henry most of the information he needed to make convincing confessions. They would show him crime scene photographs, read him details from police reports, and even take him to visit the locations where murders had occurred. Henry had an excellent memory, and he was very good at absorbing all of this information and then repeating it back as if he had been there when the crimes happened. The investigators also made Henry's life in jail much more comfortable in exchange for his confessions. Instead of being treated like a regular prisoner, Henry was allowed to walk around the jail without handcuffs. He was given special privileges like television access, cigarettes, and his favorite foods including steak dinners and strawberry milkshakes. Henry quickly realized that the more murders he confessed to, the better he was treated. The investigators were so grateful to be closing their unsolved cases that they were willing to give Henry almost anything he wanted. This created a powerful incentive for Henry to keep confessing, whether the confessions were true or not. As news of Henry's confessions spread, he became a media sensation. Newspapers and television stations across the country began reporting on the most prolific serial killer in American history. Henry enjoyed the attention and the feeling of being important and feared. Henry's confessions also began to attract the attention of Ottis Toole, his former partner, who is now serving time in a Florida prison on an arson charge. When Ottis heard about Henry's confessions on television, he decided that he wanted to be part of the story too. Ottis contacted authorities and began making his own confessions to murders. He claimed that he and Henry had committed many killings together during their travels in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Ottis also supported many of Henry's confession stories, providing what seemed like corroborating evidence. The partnership between Henry and Ottis in their confessions made the stories seem more credible to law enforcement. When two people independently told similar stories about the same murders, it seemed impossible that they could both be lying. The investigators did not realize that Henry and Ottis were coordinating their stories through letters and phone calls. By October 1983, just 4 months after Henry's first confession, law enforcement officials were claiming that Henry and Ottis had committed at least 69 murders. At a press conference, they announced that the two men were responsible for a killing spree that stretched across multiple states and had lasted for several years. The number of murders attributed to Henry continued to grow rapidly. By January 1984, the count had reached 81 confirmed killings. By March 1985, investigators were claiming that Henry had committed 90 murders in 20 different states. The final count would eventually reach over 200 murders that were officially closed based on Henry's confessions. Henry seemed to enjoy the process of confessing to murders. He would sit with investigators for hours, spinning elaborate tales of violence and describing in gruesome detail how he had supposedly killed victim after victim. The more horrific and shocking his stories were, the more attention he received. Some of Henry's most outrageous claims involved the supposed satanic cult called the Hand of Death. He told investigators that he and Ottis had been members of this nationwide organization that killed people as human sacrifices to Satan. He claimed that the cult had given them contracts to murder specific individuals and that they had killed dozens of people on the cult's orders. Henry also claimed that the Hand of Death cult had connections to other notorious criminals and events. He said that he had provided Jim Jones with the cyanide used in the Jonestown massacre in Guyana. He claimed that cult members had killed people by crucifixion and had eaten the flesh of their victims. These satanic cult stories were so bizarre and elaborate that some investigators were skeptical from the beginning. However, other law enforcement officials were willing to believe almost anything Henry said because his confessions were helping them solve so many cases. Throughout 1983 and 1984, Henry continued to confess to more and more murders. He would meet with investigators from different states almost every day, adding new victims to his supposed total. The Lucas Task Force was working overtime to process all of his confessions and match them to unsolved cases. Henry's treatment at the Georgetown jail became even more privileged as his confessions continued. He was essentially treated like a celebrity rather than a prisoner. Investigators would take him out to restaurants for meals, let him smoke cigarettes whenever he wanted, and even allowed him to have conjugal visits with women who were fascinated by his notoriety. The media attention surrounding Henry's case continued to grow throughout this period. He was featured on television programs, in newspaper articles, and in magazine stories. Henry gave interviews to reporters, always maintaining his claims that he had killed hundreds of people across the United States. However, even as Henry's confessions were being accepted by law enforcement and reported by the media, some people were beginning to have doubts about their accuracy. Journalists who investigated Henry's claims more carefully were finding inconsistencies and impossibilities in his stories. The first serious challenge to Henry's credibility would come from investigative reporters who took the time to fact-check his confessions against available evidence. These journalists would discover that Henry's stories contained numerous problems that suggested he was not telling the truth about most of the murders he claimed to have committed. While law enforcement officials across the United States were celebrating their success in closing hundreds of murder cases based on Henry Lee Lucas's confessions, a few investigative journalists were beginning to ask hard questions about whether Henry's stories were actually true. The most prominent of these skeptical journalists was Hugh Ainsworth, a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald newspaper. Ainsworth was an experienced investigative journalist who had covered many high-profile criminal cases, including the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Ainsworth became interested in the Henry Lucas case when he noticed that the sheer number of confessions seemed almost impossible. According to the claims being made by the Lucas Task Force, Henry had committed murders at an incredible pace, sometimes killing multiple people in different states on the same day. To verify Henry's confessions, Ainsworth began the painstaking process of checking Henry's stories against documented facts. He looked at employment records, prison records, hospital records, and any other documentation that could prove where Henry had been on specific dates. What Ainsworth discovered was shocking. In case after case, he found that Henry could not possibly have committed the murders he was confessing to because he was somewhere else at the time. For example, police had accepted Henry's confession to a murder that occurred on September 12, 1981, in Houston, Texas, even though records showed that Henry was in jail in Maryland on that date. In another case, Henry had confessed to a murder that took place on September 9, 1975, in Tyler, Texas. However, Ainsworth found employment records showing that Henry was working at a mushroom farm in Pennsylvania on that day. It would have been physically impossible for Henry to be in both places at the same time. As Ainsworth continued his investigation, he found more and more examples of impossible confessions. According to his calculations, for Henry to have committed all the murders he claimed, he would have had to drive his old, unreliable car over 11,000 miles in a single month. This would have required him to drive approximately 370 miles every single day, which was clearly impossible given the condition of his vehicles. Ainsworth also discovered that many of Henry's confessions contained details that were wrong or inconsistent with the actual evidence from crime scenes. In some cases, Henry described victims as being killed in ways that did not match the autopsy reports. In other cases, he claimed to have used weapons that were different from what the evidence showed. Working with fellow journalist Jim Henderson, Ainsworth published a major investigative story in the Dallas Times-Herald in April 1985. The story was titled Mass Murder or Mass Deception, and it presented detailed evidence that most of Henry's confessions were false. The newspaper investigation showed that Henry had been coached by law enforcement officials who provided him with information about the crimes before he confessed. The reporters found that investigators had shown Henry crime scene photographs, given him access to case files, and even taken him to visit murder locations. This allowed Henry to learn enough details about each case to make a convincing confession. The investigation also revealed that Henry was being rewarded with special privileges each time he confessed to a murder. The better treatment he received in jail, combined with the attention and notoriety he gained from his confessions, gave Henry strong incentives to keep lying about murders he had not committed. Despite the overwhelming evidence presented by Ainsworth and Henderson, many law enforcement officials refused to believe that Henry's confessions were false. The Texas Rangers, in particular, defended their work and insisted that Henry was telling the truth about most of his claimed murders. Texas Ranger Bob Prince, who was one of the leaders of the Lucas Task Force, publicly defended Henry's confessions even after the newspaper investigation. Prince argued that Henry had provided too many accurate details for all of his confessions to be false. He claimed that the journalists were wrong, and that Henry really was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. However, other officials began to have doubts about Henry's credibility after the newspaper investigation was published. Vic Feasel, the district attorney of McLennan County in Waco, Texas, had been skeptical of Henry's confessions from the beginning. When he saw the evidence presented by Ainsworth and Henderson, he decided to launch his own investigation. Feasel's investigation focused on 3 murders in his county that Henry had confessed to committing. When Feasel's team examined the evidence carefully, They found that Henry could not have been responsible for any of these killings. In each case, there was documented proof that Henry had been somewhere else when the murders occurred. Based on his findings, Feasel publicly declared that Henry Lucas was a fraud who had been making false confessions. He called for a complete review of all the cases that had been closed based on Henry's claims. Feasel's statements created a major controversy within Texas law enforcement. The Texas Rangers accused Feasel of grandstanding and trying to get publicity for himself. They insisted that their investigation had been thorough and professional. The conflict between Feasel and the Texas Rangers escalated when Feasel appeared on television to discuss his findings. He stated publicly that Henry's confessions were the biggest hoax in law enforcement history, and that hundreds of murder cases had been improperly closed. In response to these criticisms, Texas Attorney General Jim Maddox decided to conduct his own independent investigation of Henry's confessions. Maddox assigned a team of investigators to review the evidence and determine whether Henry's claims were credible. The Attorney General's investigation, which was completed in 1986, reached the same conclusions as the newspaper investigation and Feasel's inquiry. The official report stated that Henry Lucas was a fabulist who had made false confessions to hundreds of murders. The Attorney General's report found that Henry had obtained most of his information about the crimes from law enforcement officials during the interview process. The investigators had inadvertently provided Henry with enough details to make convincing confessions by showing him photographs, case files, and crime scene locations. The report also found that there was no physical evidence linking Henry to most of the murders he had confessed to. In the vast majority of cases, the only evidence against Henry was his own confession, which the investigation had now shown to be unreliable. Perhaps most damaging to Henry's credibility was the discovery that he had solid alibis for many of the murders he claimed to have committed. Employment records, medical records, and other documentation showed that Henry had been in different states or even in jail when many of the murders occurred. The Attorney General's investigation concluded that Henry Lucas had been truthful about only 3 murders: the killing of his mother in 1960, the murder of Becky Powell in 1982, and the killing of Kate Rich in 1983. All of his other confessions were determined to be false. Despite these official findings, Henry continued to maintain his claims that he had killed hundreds of people. He seemed to enjoy the attention and notoriety that came with being considered one of America's most prolific serial killers. However, his credibility with law enforcement and the media had been severely damaged. By 1984, before the investigation into his false confessions was complete, Henry Lee Lucas had been convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death for one of them. The case that put him on death row involved the murder of an unidentified woman who became known as Orange Socks because that was the only clothing she was wearing when her body was found. The Orange Socks murder had occurred on October 31st, 1979, Halloween night. The victim's body was discovered in a ditch alongside Interstate 35 near Georgetown, Texas. She had been raped and strangled to death, then left naked except for a pair of bright orange socks. For years, police had no leads in the Orange Socks case. They could not identify the victim, and they had no suspects. The case remained unsolved until Henry confessed to the murder in 1983 as part of his confession spree. Henry's confession to the Orange Socks murder was not particularly detailed or convincing. He provided no information about the crime that was not already known to police. However, given Henry's supposed track record as a serial killer, investigators accepted his confession and charged him with capital murder. The prosecution's case against Henry was based almost entirely on his confession. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, no witnesses who had seen him with the victim, and no forensic evidence connecting him to the murder. The only reason Henry was convicted was because he had confessed. At his trial in 1984, Henry was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. The jury believed that his confession was truthful and that he deserved the ultimate punishment for his crime. Henry was sent to death row at the Huntsville prison unit in Texas. However, as the investigation into Henry's false confessions progressed, serious questions arose about his guilt in the Orange Socks case. The Attorney General's investigation found that Henry had solid alibi evidence showing that he was in Florida at the time the Orange Socks murder was committed. Work records and a cashed paycheck proved that Henry had been employed at a roofing job in Jacksonville, Florida, on October 31st, 1979. He had worked a full day and cashed his paycheck just hours before the Orange Sox murder occurred in Texas. It would have been physically impossible for Henry to travel from Florida to Texas in time to commit the murder. Despite this alibi evidence, Henry remained on death row while his appeals worked their way through the court system. He came close to execution several times, but each time his lawyers managed to get stays of execution based on questions about his guilt. The Orange Sox case became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Henry Lucas investigation. Here was a man sitting on death row for a murder that he almost certainly did not commit, convicted solely based on a confession that investigators should have known was false. As the years passed and the evidence of Henry's innocence in most of his confessed murders became overwhelming, pressure began to build for his death sentence to be commuted. Legal experts, journalists, and even some law enforcement officials argued that executing Henry for the Orange Sox murder would be a miscarriage of justice. In 1998, the case reached the desk of Texas Governor George W. Bush, who was considering a run for president. Bush had a reputation as a strong supporter of the death penalty who rarely granted clemency to death row inmates. However, the evidence of Henry's innocence in the Orange Sox case was so compelling that even Bush could not ignore it. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which had to make a recommendation before the governor could act, voted to recommend commutation by a margin of 17-1. On June 26, 1998, Governor Bush commuted Henry's death sentence to life in prison. In making this decision, Bush stated, "I take this action so that all Texans can continue to trust the integrity and fairness of our criminal justice system." This was the first and only time that George W. Bush commuted a death sentence during his tenure as Texas governor. The decision was particularly significant because it acknowledged that the criminal justice system had failed in Henry's case and that an innocent man had come close to being executed. Henry's death sentence commutation did not mean that he would ever be released from prison. He was still serving multiple life sentences for the murders of Becky Powell and Kate Rich, as well as sentences for other crimes. The commutation simply meant that he would not be executed for a murder he did not commit. While Henry avoided execution, many of the murder cases that had been closed based on his false confessions remained officially solved. Even though investigators knew that Henry had lied about most of his confessions, very few of the cases were reopened or reinvestigated. This meant that the real killers in hundreds of murder cases remained free, while the families of victims continued to believe that justice had been served. The failure to reopen these cases was one of the most damaging long-term consequences of the Henry Lucas scandal. The Henry Lucas case also had serious consequences for the reputation of the Texas Rangers law enforcement agency. The Rangers had been the primary investigators pushing Henry's confessions, and their credibility was severely damaged when the confessions were exposed as false. Several Texas Rangers involved in the Lucas investigation faced criticism and disciplinary action. The scandal led to changes in how the Rangers conducted investigations and handled confessions from suspects. The case also led to broader reforms in police interrogation techniques and confession procedures. Law enforcement agencies across the country began implementing new policies to prevent the kind of problems that had occurred in the Lucas case. These reforms included requirements that interrogations be recorded, that suspects not be shown case files or evidence before confessing, and that confessions be corroborated with independent evidence before cases could be closed. Despite these reforms, the damage from the Henry Lucas case continued to affect the criminal justice system for years. The scandal had shown how easy it was for false confessions to be accepted and how many cases could be improperly closed as a result. After his death sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1998, Henry Lee Lucas settled into a routine of prison life that would continue until his death. He was housed at various Texas Department of Criminal Justice facilities, spending most of his time at the Ellis I Unit near Huntsville. In prison, Henry was assigned to work in the garment factory, where he operated sewing machines to make uniforms for correctional officers. This job gave him a sense of purpose and helped pass the time during his long incarceration. Fellow inmates and prison staff noted that Henry was generally well-behaved and caused few problems. Henry's personality in prison was quite different from the attention-seeking confessor he had been during the 1980s. He became more withdrawn and reflective, spending much of his time reading religious materials and claiming to have found faith in Christianity. According to prison officials, Henry became what they called a model prisoner. He followed prison rules, avoided fights with other inmates, and participated in rehabilitation programs. This behavior was in stark contrast to his earlier years of violence and criminal activity. During his time in prison, Henry continued to receive attention from journalists, researchers, and true crime enthusiasts who were fascinated by his case. He gave occasional interviews, though he was less willing to discuss his confessions than he had been in the 1980s. In these later interviews, Henry's stance on his confessions became somewhat inconsistent. Sometimes he would maintain that he had killed hundreds of people, while at other times he would admit that most of his confessions had been false. He seemed to enjoy the continued attention, but was also aware that his credibility had been destroyed. Henry developed various health problems as he aged in prison. He suffered from heart disease and other conditions related to his years of poor living, heavy drinking, and the stress of incarceration. Prison medical staff treated these conditions as they arose. Despite his health problems, Henry remained mentally alert throughout most of his imprisonment. He was able to read, write letters, and carry on conversations with visitors and fellow inmates. His memory, which had been so important to his false confessions, remained sharp. Henry's case continued to attract academic and professional interest from criminologists, psychologists, and legal experts. Researchers studied his confessions as an example of how false confessions could be generated and accepted by the criminal justice system. These studies helped advance understanding of the psychological factors that could lead to false confessions and the investigative techniques that could either prevent or encourage them. Henry's case became a textbook example of what could go wrong when proper safeguards were not in place. During the 1990s, Henry occasionally expressed regret for his false confessions and the damage they had caused to the criminal justice system. He admitted that he had lied about most of the murders and acknowledged that his lies had prevented real killers from being caught. However, Henry never fully explained why he had made so many false confessions. He offered various explanations at different times, including his desire for better treatment in jail, his enjoyment of the attention, and his anger at law enforcement. The true motivations for his extensive lies remained somewhat unclear. One consistent aspect of Henry's later statements was his insistence that he had only killed 3 people: his mother, Becky Powell, and Kate Rich. He maintained that these were the only murders he had actually committed, and investigators generally accepted this assessment. Henry also continued to express remorse for killing Becky Powell, whom he claimed to have genuinely loved. He said that her murder was the crime he regretted most, and that he wished he could undo what he had done to her. In his conversations with prison counselors and chaplains, Henry often discussed his troubled childhood and the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his mother. He seemed to understand that his early experiences had contributed to his later criminal behavior, though he never used this as an excuse for his actions. Henry's religious conversion in prison appeared to be genuine, though some observers remained skeptical given his history of manipulation and lies. He participated in chapel services, read the Bible regularly, and claimed to have asked God for forgiveness for his crimes. Prison officials noted that Henry's religious faith seemed to give him some peace during his final years. He appeared less angry and bitter than he had been during his earlier incarceration, and he expressed hope that he might find redemption despite his past. Henry also maintained correspondence with some family members and developed friendships with a few fellow inmates and prison staff members. These relationships provided him with some social connection during his long years of imprisonment. As Henry aged, his health problems became more serious. He developed congestive heart failure, which is a condition where the heart cannot pump blood effectively. This condition required ongoing medical treatment and monitoring by prison medical staff. Despite his declining health, Henry remained interested in current events and followed news stories about other criminal cases. He was particularly interested in cases involving serial killers and false confessions, perhaps seeing connections to his own experiences. In his final years, Henry reflected on his legacy and the impact his case had on American law enforcement. He seemed to understand that while his false confessions had caused great harm, they had also led to important reforms in police procedures and confession handling. Henry expressed some satisfaction that his case had resulted in changes that might prevent other false confessions in the future. He saw this as perhaps the only positive outcome from his years of lying to police investigators. As the year 2001 began, Henry's health continued to deteriorate. The congestive heart failure was putting increasing strain on his body, and prison medical staff monitored his condition closely. Despite his illness, Henry continued his daily routines and remained mentally alert. On the evening of March 12th, 2001. Henry Lee Lucas was found dead in his bed at the Ellis I Prison Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 64 years old and had been serving multiple life sentences for the murders of Becky Powell and Kate Rich. Prison officials determined that he had died of natural causes, specifically congestive heart failure. Henry's death came peacefully in his sleep, a stark contrast to the violent lives of the victims he had actually killed and the hundreds of victims he had falsely claimed to murder. Prison spokesman Larry Fitzgerald announced the death and confirmed that it appeared to be from natural causes, ending the life of one of America's most notorious false confessors. The news of Henry's death was reported in newspapers across the United States, with most articles focusing on his role as the confession killer who had claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders. However, the stories also noted that most of his confessions had been proven false and that he had likely killed only 3 people. Henry's body was taken to the Huntsville Funeral Home, where prison officials waited to see if any family members would claim his remains. Given Henry's estrangement from most of his family and his notorious reputation, it was unclear whether anyone would take responsibility for his burial. The reaction to Henry's death was mixed among law enforcement officials, journalists, and the families of crime victims. Some people felt relief that a chapter in American criminal justice history had finally closed, while others remained angry about the damage his false confessions had caused. Hugh Ainsworth, the journalist who had exposed Henry's false confessions in the 1980s, commented on Henry's death by noting that while Henry was certainly a killer, he was not the prolific serial murderer he had claimed to be. Ainsworth emphasized that hundreds of real murders remained unsolved because of Henry's lies. For the families of genuine murder victims whose cases had been falsely closed based on Henry's confessions, his death brought no real closure. Their loved ones' real killers were still free, and justice had not been served in their cases. The Texas Rangers, who had been heavily criticized for their role in accepting Henry's false confessions, made no official statement about his death. The scandal from the Lucas case had already led to significant changes in the agency's procedures and had damaged the reputation of several veteran Rangers. District attorneys and police chiefs in jurisdictions where Henry had confessed to murders faced a difficult decision about whether to reopen those cases. While most officials acknowledged that Henry's confessions were likely false, few were willing to admit publicly that they had closed cases improperly. The academic and research communities that had studied Henry's case noted that his death ended the possibility of further interviews and psychological studies. However, his case would continue to be analyzed for years to come as an example of how false confessions could be generated and accepted. Criminologists and legal experts emphasized that Henry's legacy should be the reforms his case had inspired in police interrogation techniques and confession procedures. New requirements for recording interrogations and corroborating confessions had been implemented largely because of problems exposed in Henry's case. Mental health professionals who had studied Henry noted that his death closed the book on one of the most complex psychological profiles in criminal history. His combination of genuine murders, false confessions, and attention-seeking behavior had provided unique insights into criminal psychology. The true crime community, including authors, documentary filmmakers, and podcast creators, would continue to be fascinated by Henry's story long after his death. His case combined elements of real violence, psychological manipulation, and systemic failure that made it compelling to audiences. Law enforcement training programs continued to use Henry's case as an example of what could go wrong when proper procedures were not followed. Police academies and detective schools taught new officers about the dangers of accepting confessions without independent corroboration. The victims' rights community pointed to Henry's case as an example of how the criminal justice system could fail both victims and their families. The false closure provided by Henry's confessions had prevented real investigations and left many families without true justice. Some observers noted the irony that Henry, who had spent his life seeking attention and notoriety, had achieved a kind of twisted immortality through his false confessions. His name would be remembered not for the 3 murders he actually committed, but for the hundreds he had lied about. The Netflix documentary series The Confession Killer, which premiered in 2019, brought renewed attention to Henry's case and introduced his story to a new generation of viewers. The series emphasized the law enforcement failures and the ongoing impact on unsolved cases. Legal scholars continued to debate whether Henry's death sentence commutation by Governor George W. Bush had set an important precedent for preventing wrongful executions. The case remained a significant example of how doubts about guilt could influence even the strongest supporters of capital punishment. Prison officials who had worked with Henry during his final years remembered him as a generally cooperative inmate who had seemed to find some measure of peace through his claimed religious conversion. However, they also noted that his manipulative nature made it difficult to know what he truly believed. The location where Henry died, the LSI unit in Huntsville, was the same prison system that housed Texas's death row. The irony was not lost on observers that Henry had died naturally in prison rather than being executed for a crime he probably did not commit. Mental health advocates used Henry's case to argue for better treatment of childhood abuse victims and improved mental health services. They pointed out that Henry's horrific childhood experiences had contributed to his later criminal behavior and psychological problems. The debate over how many people Henry had actually killed continued even after his death. While most experts agreed that he had killed only 3 people, some investigators continued to believe that he might have been responsible for a few additional murders that were never properly investigated. The death of Henry Lee Lucas in 2001 marked the end of his personal story, but the impact of his case on American criminal justice continued to reverberate for years afterward. His legacy became one of the most significant examples of how false confessions could corrupt the investigation of serious crimes. In the years following Henry's death, researchers and legal experts conducted extensive studies of his case to understand how such widespread acceptance of false confessions could have occurred. These studies identified several key factors that had contributed to the problem. The first major factor was the lack of proper recording procedures during Henry's interrogations. Police investigators in the 1980s rarely tape-recorded their interviews with suspects, which meant there was no objective record of how information had been shared during the confession process. Without recordings, it was impossible to determine how much information investigators had inadvertently provided to Henry before he made his confessions. This allowed Henry to appear to have inside knowledge of crimes when he was actually just repeating details that police had already told him. The second major factor was the failure to seek independent corroboration for Henry's confessions. In case after case, investigators accepted Henry's word alone as sufficient evidence to close murder files, without conducting additional investigation to verify his claims. This lack of corroboration meant that obvious problems with Henry's confessions were not discovered until much later. If investigators had checked Henry's whereabouts more carefully, they would have found that he had alibis for many of the murders he claimed to have committed. The third factor was the incentive structure that encouraged Henry to make false confessions. The special treatment he received in jail, combined with the attention and notoriety his confessions brought him, created powerful motivations to continue lying about murders. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began implementing reforms designed to prevent similar problems in the future. Many departments adopted requirements that all interrogations of serious suspects be recorded, either on audio or videotape. Additional reforms included policies requiring that confessions be corroborated with independent evidence before cases could be closed, and procedures to prevent suspects from being shown case files or crime scene materials before making their statements. These reforms were not implemented uniformly across all jurisdictions, and some law enforcement agencies resisted changes to their traditional interrogation methods. However, the Henry Lucas case provided a compelling example of why such reforms were necessary. The case also led to increased awareness among defense attorneys about the possibility of false confessions. Lawyers began to challenge confessions more aggressively and to demand better documentation of how confessions were obtained. Legal scholars used Henry's case to argue for stricter standards of evidence in cases where confessions were the primary proof of guilt. They pointed out that confessions, even detailed ones, could be unreliable without independent corroboration. The psychological community also gained valuable insights from Henry's case about the factors that could lead to false confessions. Researchers identified personality traits and circumstances that made some individuals more likely to confess to crimes they had not committed. These psychological studies helped improve understanding of how interrogation techniques could inadvertently encourage false confessions, and they led to the development of better training for police investigators. The victims' families who had been affected by Henry's false confessions continued to struggle with the aftermath of his lies long after his death. Many had believed for years that their loved ones' killers had been caught and punished, only to learn that the real perpetrators remained free. Some of these families organized advocacy groups to push for reopening the cases that had been falsely closed based on Henry's confessions. However, they faced resistance from law enforcement agencies that were reluctant to admit their mistakes. The media coverage of Henry's case also evolved over time. While early reports had accepted his claims at face value, later journalism took a more critical approach to examining confession evidence and police procedures. Investigative journalists like Hugh Ainsworth became models for how reporters should fact-check claims made by law enforcement agencies. Their work showed the importance of independent verification rather than simply reporting official statements. The academic study of Henry's case contributed to a broader understanding of wrongful convictions and the role that false confessions played in miscarriages of justice. Researchers found that false confessions were more common than previously believed. Law schools began using Henry's case as a teaching example in courses on criminal procedure and evidence. Students learned about the dangers of relying too heavily on confession evidence and the importance of proper investigative procedures. The case also influenced the development of innocence projects and other organizations dedicated to preventing and correcting wrongful convictions. These groups used Henry's story to illustrate how systemic problems could lead to multiple miscarriages of justice. Police training programs incorporated lessons from Henry's case into their curricula for new officers. Recruits learned about the importance of objective investigation and the dangers of confirmation bias in criminal cases. The broader criminal justice community came to recognize that Henry's case represented not just the actions of one disturbed individual, but systemic failures that needed to be addressed through comprehensive reforms. International law enforcement agencies also studied Henry's case as an example of problems that could occur in any criminal justice system. The lessons learned from his false confessions influenced police procedures in other countries as well. The entertainment industry's portrayal of Henry's case evolved over time as well. Early movies and television shows had often sensationalized his claims of being a prolific serial killer, but later productions took a more critical approach. The 2019 Netflix documentary series, The Confession Killer, represented a more sophisticated understanding of Henry's case, focusing on the law enforcement failures rather than just the shocking nature of his claims. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators continued to be fascinated by Henry's case, often attempting to determine which of his confessions might have been true. However, most experts warned against giving credibility to any of his uncorroborated claims. The case also raised important questions about the role of mental illness in the criminal justice system. Henry's childhood abuse and psychological problems had clearly contributed to his criminal behavior, but they had also made him vulnerable to manipulation by investigators. Mental health advocates used Henry's story to argue for better screening and treatment of suspects with psychological disorders. They pointed out that such individuals might be more likely to make false confessions under pressure. The technological advances that occurred after Henry's death, particularly in DNA testing and forensic science, provided new opportunities to investigate some of the cases where he had confessed. However, in many instances, physical evidence had been lost or destroyed over the years. Some cold case investigators attempted to use modern techniques to determine whether Henry might have been involved in murders where physical evidence still existed. These efforts generally confirmed that Henry had not been responsible for most of the crimes he had claimed. The Henry Lucas case became a landmark in the study of serial crime investigation. It showed how the desire to solve multiple cases quickly could lead investigators to accept easy solutions that were not actually correct. This lesson influenced how law enforcement agencies approached cases involving suspected serial killers. New procedures emphasized the importance of maintaining objectivity and not allowing the excitement of potentially solving multiple cases to override proper investigative protocols. Even decades after Henry Lee Lucas's death in 2001, questions remained about the true extent of his criminal activities and the full impact of his false confessions on American law enforcement. While most experts agreed that he had only killed 3 people, some aspects of his case continued to puzzle investigators and researchers. One of the most persistent mysteries concerned whether Henry might have committed a few additional murders beyond the 3 that were conclusively proven. Some law enforcement officials who had worked closely with him maintained that certain confessions contained details that seemed impossible to fake. For example, one Texas police officer claimed that Henry had led investigators directly to a deer stand where a murder had taken place, providing information that seemed too specific to have been guessed or learned from case files. However, Critics argued that such instances could be explained by Henry's extensive access to crime scene information. Another ongoing question involved the relationship between Henry and Ottis Toole, and whether they might have committed crimes together that were never properly investigated. While both men were known to be liars and fantasists, some investigators believed their partnership had involved at least some genuine criminal activity beyond what was proven in court. The hand of death cult claims made by Henry and Ottis remained particularly controversial. While no evidence was ever found for the existence of such a satanic organization, some investigators wondered whether the two men might have been involved with smaller criminal networks that they had exaggerated into elaborate cult stories. Researchers who studied Henry's case also grappled with questions about his psychological makeup and what had motivated his extensive false confessions. While the material rewards and attention he received clearly played a role, some experts believed there were deeper psychological factors involved. Dr. Joel Norris, who wrote extensively about serial killers, suggested that Henry's false confessions might have been a way for him to achieve a sense of power and control that he had lacked throughout his abused childhood. By claiming responsibility for hundreds of murders, Henry could present himself as one of the most feared men in America. Other psychologists theorized that Henry's confessions represented a form of psychological compensation for his feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness. In his fantasies, he was not a pathetic drifter, but a master criminal who had outsmarted law enforcement across multiple states. The question of whether Henry genuinely remembered committing murders he had not actually done remained particularly intriguing to mental health professionals. Some researchers wondered whether Henry's traumatic childhood and substance abuse history might have created false memories that felt real to him. This possibility was supported by Henry's apparent sincerity during many of his confessions. Investigators who interviewed him often noted that he seemed to genuinely believe his own stories, at least while he was telling them. The role of suggestion and coaching in creating Henry's false confessions continued to be studied by experts in police interrogation techniques. His case became a textbook example of how well-meaning investigators could inadvertently contaminate a suspect's statements. Researchers found that Henry had been particularly susceptible to suggestion because of his desire to please authority figures and his need for attention and approval. These personality traits, likely developed during his abusive childhood, made him an ideal candidate for producing false confessions. The long-term impact on the families of genuine murder victims whose cases had been falsely closed remained one of the most tragic aspects of Henry's legacy. Many of these families continued to seek justice decades after Henry's confessions had derailed the investigations into their loved ones' deaths. Some families hired private investigators or worked with cold case units to try to reopen investigations that had been prematurely closed. However, they often found that evidence had been lost or destroyed, and that witnesses had died or could no longer be located. The legal system's reluctance to acknowledge mistakes also created obstacles for families seeking to have cases reopened. District attorneys and police chiefs were often unwilling to admit publicly that they had been fooled by Henry's confessions, making it difficult to get official support for new investigations. A few cases were eventually reopened and resulted in arrests of the actual perpetrators. These successes provided some vindication for the critics who had argued that Henry's confessions were false, but they represented only a small fraction of the hundreds of cases that had been affected. The technological advances in forensic science that occurred in the decades after Henry's confession spree offered new possibilities for solving some of the cold cases. DNA testing, in particular, provided opportunities to identify perpetrators even when traditional investigative methods had failed. However, the passage of time had made such investigations more difficult. Physical evidence from crimes committed in the 1970s and 1980s was often no longer available, and many potential witnesses had died or could not be located. Some modern investigators attempted to use geographic profiling and other analytical techniques to determine whether any patterns in unsolved murders might indicate the work of a genuine serial killer who had remained free while Henry received credit for their crimes. These efforts occasionally identified potential suspects in individual cases, but they did not reveal evidence of any single killer who might have been responsible for large numbers of the murders Henry had claimed. The impact of Henry's case on the Texas Rangers continued to be felt long after his death. The agency had implemented significant reforms in response to the scandal, but the damage to its reputation took years to repair. Some veteran rangers who had been involved in the Lucas investigation retired early or left the agency rather than face continued scrutiny of their work. The scandal became a defining moment in the Rangers' history, comparable to other controversial episodes from earlier decades. The broader law enforcement community used Henry's case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of cutting corners in major investigations. Police academies and training programs regularly featured case studies based on the Lucas investigation to illustrate proper and improper investigative techniques. International law enforcement agencies also studied Henry's case as an example of how false confessions could contaminate multiple investigations simultaneously. Police forces in other countries implemented safeguards inspired by the lessons learned from Henry's confession spree. The media's role in promoting Henry's false claims also came under scrutiny in later analyses of the case. Journalists and news organizations had often reported Henry's confessions without sufficient skepticism, contributing to public acceptance of his claims. This aspect of the case influenced journalism education and media ethics discussions. Reporters were taught to be more critical of official sources and to seek independent verification of dramatic claims, even when those claims came from law enforcement agencies. The entertainment industry's treatment of Henry's case evolved significantly over time. Early movies and television shows had often portrayed him as a genuine monster who had killed hundreds of people, but later productions took a more critical approach. The 2019 Netflix documentary, The Confession Killer, represented a more sophisticated understanding of the case, focusing on the institutional failures that had allowed Henry's lies to be accepted rather than simply sensationalizing his claims. Academic researchers continued to mine Henry's case for insights into criminal psychology, police procedures, and the nature of false confessions. New studies appeared regularly in criminology and psychology journals, each attempting to extract additional lessons from this unique case. The case also influenced the development of protocols for handling suspected serial killer investigations. Law enforcement agencies adopted procedures designed to prevent the kind of tunnel vision and confirmation bias that had characterized the Lucas investigation. These reforms included requirements for independent review of evidence, mandatory consultation with behavioral experts, and procedures for testing the credibility of confession evidence before accepting it as reliable. The Henry Lee Lucas case became a watershed moment in American criminal justice history, fundamentally changing how law enforcement agencies approached confession evidence and serial crime investigations. The lessons learned from his extensive false confessions continued to influence police procedures, legal standards, and academic research well into the 21st century. One of the most significant changes prompted by Henry's case was the widespread adoption of recorded interrogations. Prior to the Lucas scandal, most police departments did not routinely tape or video record their interviews with suspects, making it impossible to review how confessions were obtained. The lack of recordings in Henry's case had made it difficult to determine exactly how much information investigators had provided to him before he made his confessions. This problem led to requirements in many jurisdictions that all interrogations in serious cases be electronically recorded. By the early 2000s, hundreds of police departments across the United States had implemented mandatory recording policies. These recordings not only protected suspects from coercive tactics, but also protected investigators from false accusations of misconduct. The recordings proved particularly valuable in cases where suspects later claimed their confessions had been coerced or fabricated. Judges and juries could review the actual interrogation process rather than relying on conflicting testimony about what had occurred. Another major reform inspired by Henry's case involved the corroboration of confession evidence. The Lucas investigation had shown how dangerous it could be to close cases based solely on a suspect's admissions, without independent verification of their claims. Many law enforcement agencies adopted policies requiring that confessions be supported by additional evidence before cases could be considered solved. This might include physical evidence, witness testimony, or other documentation that confirmed the confessor's involvement. These corroboration requirements helped prevent the acceptance of false confessions, but they also meant that some legitimate confessions could not be used to close cases where supporting evidence was lacking. This trade-off was generally considered acceptable given the problems created by uncorroborated confessions. The psychological research conducted on Henry's case also led to better understanding of the factors that could contribute to false confessions. Mental health professionals identified several risk factors that made individuals more likely to confess to crimes they had not committed. These risk factors included mental illness, developmental disabilities, substance abuse problems, and histories of childhood abuse. Investigators were trained to be particularly careful when interrogating suspects who exhibited these characteristics. The research also identified interrogation techniques that could inadvertently encourage false confessions. These included lengthy interrogations, sleep deprivation, false promises of leniency, and the presentation of fabricated evidence. Law enforcement training programs began emphasizing the importance of avoiding these problematic techniques and using interrogation methods that were less likely to produce false admissions. The Henry Lucas case also influenced the development of specialized units for investigating serial crimes. Rather than allowing individual detectives to work in isolation, many agencies created task forces with multiple investigators and supervisory oversight. These task forces were designed to prevent the kind of tunnel vision that had characterized the Lucas investigation, where investigators became so invested in their theory that they ignored contradictory evidence. The use of behavioral analysts and criminal profilers also became more common in serial crime investigations. These experts could provide objective assessments of confession evidence and help identify inconsistencies that might indicate false admissions. Legal scholars used Henry's case to argue for stricter evidentiary standards in cases involving confession evidence. They pointed out that confessions, even detailed ones, should not be considered reliable without independent corroboration. Some jurisdictions adopted rules requiring that judges instruct juries about the possibility of false confessions and the need to carefully evaluate confession evidence. These instructions helped ensure that juries understood that confessions were not automatically reliable. Defense attorneys also became more aggressive in challenging confession evidence, particularly in cases where physical evidence was lacking. Henry's case provided numerous examples of how false confessions could be generated and accepted. The case influenced the development of expert testimony about false confessions. Psychologists and criminologists who had studied the phenomenon began testifying in court about the factors that could lead to unreliable admissions. This expert testimony helped judges and juries better understand how false confessions could occur, even when the confessor provided detailed and seemingly accurate information about the crime. The impact of Henry's case extended beyond the criminal justice system to influence academic research in criminology and psychology. His extensive false confessions provided researchers with a unique case study for understanding this phenomenon. Studies of Henry's case contributed to the broader understanding of wrongful convictions and the role that false confessions played in miscarriages of justice. Research showed that false confessions were involved in a significant percentage of cases where innocent people were convicted. This research helped support the work of innocence projects and other organizations dedicated to preventing and correcting wrongful convictions. Henry's case became a frequently cited example of how systemic problems could lead to multiple miscarriages of justice. The international law enforcement community also learned from Henry's case. Police agencies in other countries studied the Lucas investigation as an example of problems that could occur in any criminal justice system. Some countries implemented reforms similar to those adopted in the United States, including requirements for recorded interrogations and corroboration of confession evidence. The case also influenced international academic conferences and professional exchanges focused on criminal investigation techniques and false confession prevention. Modern technology provided new tools for investigating the types of crimes that Henry had falsely confessed to. DNA testing improved forensic techniques, and computerized databases made it possible to solve some cold cases that had been improperly closed. However, the passage of time had made many investigations more difficult. Physical evidence from crimes committed decades earlier was often no longer available, and key witnesses had died or could not be located. Some cases that had been closed based on Henry's confessions were eventually solved using modern techniques, leading to the arrest and conviction of the actual perpetrators. These successes provided vindication for the critics who had argued that Henry's confessions were unreliable. The victims' rights movement used Henry's case to argue for better protections for crime victims and their families. They pointed out that false closures of cases denied families the justice they deserved and prevented the capture of dangerous criminals. Some victims' organizations pushed for legislation requiring that families be notified when cases were reopened or when there were significant developments in investigations that had been closed based on questionable evidence. The Henry Lucas case also influenced discussions about the death penalty and the risk of executing innocent people. His near execution for a crime he probably did not commit became a powerful example of how the ultimate punishment could be applied to the wrong person. This aspect of the case was particularly significant because it involved a defendant who was clearly guilty of other serious crimes, but possibly innocent of the specific murder for which he was sentenced to die. The commutation of Henry's death sentence by Governor George W. Bush became a landmark decision that influenced later discussions about clemency and the death penalty. Legal experts noted that Bush's willingness to commute Henry's sentence, despite his general support for capital punishment, demonstrated the importance of maintaining safeguards against wrongful executions. The case also influenced the development of conviction integrity units within prosecutors' offices. These specialized units were tasked with reviewing questionable convictions and ensuring that innocent people were not punished for crimes they did not commit. Many of these units used Henry's case as an example of how systemic problems could lead to multiple wrongful convictions simultaneously. The entertainment industry's treatment of true crime stories also evolved partly in response to lessons learned from the Henry Lucas case. Producers and writers became more cautious about presenting unverified claims as fact. The success of more analytical approaches, such as the Netflix documentary The Confession Killer, showed that audiences were interested in understanding the institutional failures that allowed false confessions to be accepted. This shift in approach influenced other true crime productions and encouraged more critical examination of official narratives in criminal cases. Henry Lee Lucas died on March 12, 2001, but his impact on American criminal justice continues to this day. His case serves as a permanent reminder of how the desire to solve crimes quickly can lead investigators astray and how the acceptance of false confessions can cause immeasurable harm to the pursuit of justice. In 2019, nearly 2 decades after Henry's death, the Netflix documentary series The Confession Killer introduced his story to a new generation of viewers. The 5-part series examined not only Henry's false confessions, but also the institutional failures that allowed them to be accepted by law enforcement agencies across the country. The documentary sparked renewed interest in Henry's case and led to discussions about whether additional reforms were needed to prevent similar problems in the future. Criminal justice experts noted that while significant improvements had been made since the 1980s, the risk of false confessions remained a concern. One of the most troubling aspects of Henry's legacy was the number of murder cases that remained officially closed based on his false confessions. Despite overwhelming evidence that most of his admissions were lies, very few jurisdictions had reopened their cases for further investigation. This meant that the real killers in hundreds of murder cases had never been caught and might have gone on to commit additional crimes. The families of victims continued to be denied true justice, living with the false belief that their loved ones' murders had been solved. Some victim advocacy groups continued to pressure law enforcement agencies to reopen cases that had been closed based on Henry's confessions. However, they faced resistance from officials who were reluctant to acknowledge their mistakes or to commit resources to investigating decades-old crimes. The few cases that were successfully reopened and solved using modern investigative techniques provided some hope that justice could still be achieved, even years after Henry's false confessions had derailed the original investigations. In 2019, one particularly significant development occurred when DNA testing and genealogical research finally identified the Orange Socks victim for whom Henry had been sentenced to death. The victim was determined to be Deborah Jackson, a 23-year-old woman from Abilene, Texas, who had gone missing in 1977. The identification of Deborah Jackson provided some closure for her family members, who had never known what had happened to her. However, it also served as a reminder that Henry had nearly been executed for a crime he almost certainly did not commit. The Jackson identification was made possible by advances in forensic technology that had not existed during Henry's original prosecution. This highlighted how new scientific techniques could provide answers that had been impossible to obtain using 1980s investigative methods. Criminal justice education programs continued to use Henry's case as a teaching tool for new lawyers police officers, and forensic scientists. His story provided a comprehensive example of how multiple systemic failures could combine to produce a major scandal. Law schools incorporated discussions of the Lucas case into courses on criminal procedure, evidence, and wrongful convictions. Students learned about the importance of maintaining objectivity in investigations and the dangers of accepting confession evidence without proper corroboration. Police academies used Henry's case to train new officers about proper interrogation techniques and the factors that could lead to false confessions. Recruits learned to recognize the warning signs that might indicate an unreliable admission. The psychological and criminological research inspired by Henry's case continued to evolve as new theories were developed about the causes and prevention of false confessions. Academic journals regularly published new studies that built on the foundation established by research into Henry's behavior. Mental health professionals used insights from Henry's case to develop better screening procedures for identifying suspects who might be particularly vulnerable to making false confessions. The case also influenced the development of specialized training for investigators working with suspects who had mental illness, developmental disabilities, or histories of trauma. International law enforcement agencies continued to study Henry's case as an example of problems that could occur in any criminal justice system. The lessons learned from his false confessions influenced police procedures in countries around the world. Some nations implemented reforms similar to those adopted in the United States, including requirements for recorded interrogations and independent corroboration of confession evidence. The case also became a frequent topic at international conferences focused on criminal investigation techniques and wrongful conviction prevention. The entertainment industry's portrayal of Henry's story continued to evolve as new productions took increasingly sophisticated approaches to examining his case. Rather than simply sensationalizing his claims, modern treatments focused on the systemic issues that had allowed his lies to be accepted. This shift reflected broader changes in how true crime stories were told, with greater emphasis on institutional accountability and less focus on glorifying criminal behavior. The success of analytical approaches like The Confession Killer demonstrated that audiences were interested in understanding the complex factors that contributed to criminal justice failures. Technological advances continued to provide new opportunities for investigating cold cases that had been improperly closed based on Henry's confessions. DNA testing, genetic genealogy, and other forensic techniques offered hope that some of these cases might still be solved. However, the passage of time remained a significant obstacle to reopening old investigations. Evidence had been lost or destroyed, witnesses had died, and institutional memory of the original cases had faded. Cold case investigators who attempted to work on Lucas-related cases often found themselves starting from scratch, with little reliable information about what had actually occurred. The victims' rights community continued to use Henry's case as an example of how false closures could deny justice to crime victims and their families. They argued for stronger protections and better notification procedures when cases were reopened or significantly changed. Some organizations pushed for legislation that would automatically trigger reviews of cases closed based solely on confession evidence, particularly when the confessor had a history of making false admissions. The debate over capital punishment continued to reference Henry's case as an example of how innocent people could be sentenced to death. His near execution for the Orange Socks murder remained a powerful argument for maintaining strong safeguards in death penalty cases. Legal scholars noted that Henry's case demonstrated the importance of maintaining clemency procedures as a final check against wrongful executions. The case also influenced discussions about the standards of evidence that should be required in capital cases, with some experts arguing that confession evidence alone should never be sufficient for a death sentence. As the 21st century progressed, Henry Lee Lucas's name became permanently associated with the phenomenon of false confessions and the dangers they pose to the criminal justice system. His case served as a constant reminder that the desire to solve crimes must be balanced with the need to ensure that investigations were thorough and accurate. The reforms inspired by Henry's case, including recorded interrogations, corroboration requirements, and better training for investigators, became standard practices in modern law enforcement. While these changes could not undo the damage caused by his false confessions, they helped prevent similar problems from occurring in future cases. The families of genuine murder victims whose cases had been falsely closed continued to seek justice decades after Henry's lies had derailed their investigations. Their ongoing struggle served as a reminder that the consequences of false confessions extended far beyond the confessor himself. For the criminal justice system as a whole, Henry Lee Lucas represented both a cautionary tale about what could go wrong and a catalyst for positive change. His legacy was one of institutional failure followed by reform, of tragedy followed by lessons learned. The story of Henry Lee Lucas, the abused child who became a killer, the manipulative liar who fooled law enforcement across the nation, and the false confessor whose lies changed American criminal justice, remained one of the most complex and instructive cases in the history of American crime. His tale served as a permanent reminder that in the pursuit of justice,